Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2016. In this section we're going to look at dependencies, and as we're doing that we're going to add quite a bit more detail to the plan for the wedding. A dependency reflects the fact that some things happening depend on other things happening. The way in which they depend can be quite complex, but in a very simplest type of dependency we would say that one task cannot start until another task finishes. But we can have much more complex dependencies than that, and in particular one task may depend on many other tasks. Now let's take a pretty straightforward dependency to begin with. Let's look at tasks 6 and 7, select wedding dress and order dress. Now clearly you're not going to order the dress until you've selected it, but as soon as you've selected it you may want to order it. If I want to record in my schedule that one task is dependent on another, the very simplest way of doing it, let me select the first task, which is 6, select wedding dress, hold the control key down, press 7, order dress, and then on the task tab in the schedule group there is a button, a chain link button that says link the selected tasks. You can link tasks so one can't start until the other has finished. And this establishes the very simplest kind of dependency. If you look at the Gantt chart on the right, you can see an arrow indicating the dependency whereby task 6 must finish. You can see the arrow there starting, coming out of the finish of task 6. And you can see it going into the start of task 7, order dress. And if I pull the divider over here, you'll be able to see the contents of this predecessors column. And for task 7 it now has a predecessor of task 6. Now let's look at the durations of these tasks. Let's go back to select wedding dress. This is obviously very difficult to be absolute about, but let's suppose that the bride has decided that in order to select a wedding dress, it's really quite a long and complex process. She's probably going to need a couple of months. So let's say that in terms of working days, weekday working days, I appreciate that somebody wouldn't be planning a wedding purely on the basis of weekday working, but let's work on that basis for the moment. Let's call it 8 weeks. Let's call it 40 days. So if I click in the select wedding dress task, go to the duration, I'm going to delete what's there already and replace it with 40 days. That's fine, but in terms of ordering the dress, that's a very quick task. That's going to be a matter of perhaps going into a store and filling in a form, committing to spending a certain amount of money, probably paying a deposit on the dress. We'll talk about things like costs later on. And we're really going to say that that order is going to be placed in a day. So let's change 1 day estimated to 1 day without estimated. We can either just delete the question mark, or as you saw earlier on, we can go into the task information dialog and uncheck the estimated checkbox. Now once the dress has been ordered, the measurements and fittings can start. There will be a sequence of these until the dress is finalized, and once again let's assume that it's going to take a total period of 40 days for that to all happen. So we can select task 7 and we can select task 8. We could create a dependency in exactly the way that we did before. If I right click on the selection, if you look in the mini toolbar, there's a link button there, so I can do the link that way, and I can do the link before I establish the second duration. So let me double click on task 8, change its duration to not estimated and 40 days. There we are. And at the end of task 8 we should have a wedding dress that fits. Now let's move on to task 9, select and order bridesmaid dresses. Now this is not a task which is completely independent of the wedding dress, because as I understand it, in general the wedding dress would be selected first with a thought to what the bridesmaid dresses will be like, but you certainly wouldn't start selecting the bridesmaid dresses until you were certain about the wedding dress. So let's in this case say that the dependency is that we'll select the wedding dress before we select and order the bridesmaid dresses. Now in reality, not only would select and order bridesmaid dresses itself be broken down into subtasks, but even some of those subtasks would probably be broken down further. So for instance, measurements and fittings will probably be broken down into 2 or 3 subtasks. But let's stick with the level of detail that we've got. Let's establish that link and change the duration of the select and order bridesmaid dresses from an estimated 1 day to a total of 60 days. And as you can see, our schedule now takes us towards the end of April 2016. You can also see there that that one task, select wedding dress, has now a number of tasks dependent on it, and of course any task can not only have several tasks depending on it, but it can depend on several tasks as well. Now let's start to look at these dependencies in a little bit more detail. There is a dependency from task 6 to task 9. We just set that up. If I hover over the arrow that represents that dependency, there is a screen tip that comes up that gives me a summary of the dependency. It's an FS, a finish to start dependency. That means that the first task in the dependency, that is select wedding dress, must finish before select and order bridesmaid dresses can start. And in fact, if I double click on that line, I get a task dependency dialog where I could, if I wanted to, change that dependency. So it says from select wedding dress to select and order bridesmaid dresses, there is a finish to start dependency with a lag of 0 days. Now if I had decided in this particular case that after the wedding dress was selected and at the point that we were going to order it, we could certainly start looking at selecting and ordering bridesmaid dresses, but we needed to leave a gap of say 5 days for some reason. That would represent a lag of 5 days. And if I then click on that as my dependency, what you'll see is a 5-day gap. Effectively, we finish select wedding dress, then there's a 5-day gap, and then we select and order bridesmaid dresses. So that's a lag, and I could also have said, let's have a lag of -5 days. Now what that is, a negative lag, we often refer to as a lead. We still have a finish to start relationship, but what the relationship now says is that the second task can start 5 days before the first task finishes. So we can actually get started on selecting and ordering the bridesmaid dresses 5 days before we finish selecting the wedding dress. Now I'm going to restore that to being a lag of 0 days in a moment, but first of all I'd like you to look at the predecessors column. If you look at task 7, order dress, its predecessor was 6. Look at task 8, its predecessor was 7. Where all you see in the predecessor column is a number, that indicates a default finish to start relationship with 0 lag. If there's more complexity to the dependency, then you'll see something such as you can see for task 9. The dependency is on task 6, so it begins with a 6. The FS basically says this is a finish to start dependency, which is the default, but the reason it says that is because it then says -5 days. So that code tells you that task 9 has a finish to start relationship with task 6, which means that 6 must finish before 9 starts, but there is a 5-day lead. So in effect, task 9 can start 5 days before task 6 finishes. And whenever there is anything other than a standard default finish to start relationship, so if it's any other type of relationship, or if there is lag or lead, you'll see that coded in the predecessors column. So let me once again open up that dialog and change that back to being a 0 lag. And just before I change this back the way it was, let's look at those other types of dependency. There are 4 types in total. There's finish to start, the default. There is start to start, which means that the second task can start when the first one does. Of course, you can apply lag or lead to any of these. Finish to finish, which means that the second task can only finish when the first task finishes. And there is a start to finish, which means that the second task can't finish until the first task starts. Now, by far the most common dependency is the finish to start, but you are very likely to come across the others. And in the next section or two, I'm going to show you 1 or 2 examples of these other types of dependency. The next task that I want to look at is the task of making the guest list. Now, making the guest list can be quite a long and controversial subject. I'm going to assume for the moment that it's going to take maybe 3 to 4 weeks to try to make sure that everybody that should be invited is invited. So let's change that 8 days to 15. But let's also say that once we've got some guests on the guest list who are definitely going to be invited, we might start sending out the invitations pretty much straight away. So sending out the invitations would be a task that would pretty much run throughout the period of making the guest list. We may even wait and see what responses we get to some of the invitations until we decide to, if you like, close the guest list. So let's extend send out invitation to be, say, a 20-day task. And let's say that it's going to start 5 days after making the guest list starts. So once we've been working on the guest list for a week, we're going to start sending out the first batch of invitations and see what sort of responses we get. So we'll link those two, and then what we're going to do is change that dependency from finish to start to start and put in a 5-day lag start to start. We need to allow time for people to respond to invitations. As usual, quite a controversial subject, how long you would give people to respond to an invitation. But probably a figure of something like 2 or 3 weeks. So you're going to start sending out invitations on a particular date, and then over a period of time you'll send out some more and you'll start to get replies back. But in reality, you can't really finalize the guest list until you've received all of the responses to the invitations. So what I'm going to do is to create a link between send out invitations and finalize guest list that works on the principle that you need to allow, say, 3 weeks from the end of sending out the invitations before you can actually finalize the guest list. So I'm going to create a link between those two, and I'm going to put a lag of 15 days in, and then instead of saying that it's a finish to start link, I'm going to say it's a finish to finish link, and I'm going to say that finalize guest list is just, say, a 5-day task. And what you can see there is a situation where at some point before our deadline we're going to start to finalize the guest list, but we're not actually going to be able to finish it until 15 days after we've sent out the last invitation. Now, of course, the way that I've done that was partly just to demonstrate these types of dependency. But you'll see from that also that when you're setting up dependencies, there are often a number of options to consider. And coming up with the right sort of dependency can sometimes involve quite a bit of thought and discussion. So we've put in quite a bit more detail into our plan now for the wedding. In the next section, we're going to look at constraints and deadlines, and we're also going to do a little bit more work on dependencies as well, so please join me for that.
To get the Project 2016 course exercise and instructor demo file, click the link below in the video details. You can also scroll through the video details to find each section for this course, in addition to the playlist for the complete course for Microsoft Project 2016. Finally, if you're enjoying this training, please leave us a thumbs up and some comments. Now, let's continue with our Microsoft Project training.
Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2016. Since we last looked at the wedding plan, I've added quite a bit more detail to it in terms of the durations of many of the tasks and quite a few straightforward dependencies. So for example, if you look down at ID 20 catering, within that there are two pairs of tasks: make caterer shortlist and then book caterer and finalize menu. I've allowed 15 days for making a shortlist of caterers and talking to them, making a decision about which one to book, and then finalizing the menu with them. I've allowed 15 days for each of those tasks. And then I've done the same for the baker who's going to make the wedding cake. Now, it may look from the current plan that we could get this wedding through very, very quickly. But as you can see, one of the main issues is that we're doing everything all at once right at the start of the project. And in reality, that's not what would happen. There just wouldn't be enough time in a short period of time, of in this case a few weeks, to do all of those things at the same time. And as we'll see later on in the course, there are various factors, various reasons that will force us to spread these activities out over time. But for the moment, I want to just leave the plan like this, except for adding a few dependencies that are really very important. Now, one situation that arises very often when you're working on projects is that there are one or two key decisions to make. And there are certain things you must do before you make those key decisions, and there are certain other things you can't do until after you've made those key decisions. And what I want to look at first in this section is the very key decision of the wedding date, the date of the wedding itself. Now, you can't do everything before you decide on the date. So, for example, we talked in the previous section about making out the guest list and sending out the invitations. You can't send out the invitations until you've set the wedding date. But you can't set the wedding date until you know that the venue you're going to use is available. You may also want to make sure that the venue you're going to use for what we call in the UK the reception is available as well. But you are going to have to take some things on trust. So for example, you may have to say, well, I'm going to fix the wedding date and then see which photographers are available and book one of those photographers. So what I'm going to assume here in the wedding plan is that there are 2 or 3 key things that must happen before we can set the wedding date, and that from that point onwards various other things will be dependent on knowing that wedding date. So, appreciating once again that there is quite a lot of detail missing from this plan, I've been through the plan and I've decided that the 2 key things that I need to do are 18, that is book the reception venue, and 38, that is book the wedding venue. So I'm going to go up to set wedding date, and rather than use the linking mechanism that I've used before, I'm going to type those IDs straight into the predecessors field for set wedding date. So I'm going to put in 18, 38 and tick it. and that gives me a date on which I'm going to set the wedding date. I should point out that this is not final yet because we have a few more hurdles to overcome a little bit later on. And then from the setting the wedding date, for example, I can say, well, if I select set wedding date, then certainly sending out the invitations will be dependent on that. In reality, I need a task in here that says print the invitations, but let's just stick with send out invitations for now. Put in the linkage for that. And now we have a more realistic representation of when we're going to be in a position to send out the invitations. Particularly in the early stages of creating a project plan, it's important to review the plan from time to time to make sure that things haven't been missed. I've left a couple of items here which clearly have dependencies that aren't currently represented in the plan. So for instance, task 19, plan and finalize seating arrangements, and that will clearly need to have the guest list finalized before it can happen. So really a predecessor of plan and finalize seating arrangements should be task 14. Now there are still one or two key dependencies that I haven't put into the plan yet, but I want to turn my attention now to constraints and deadlines. Let me insert a completely new task into this schedule. And you see that it is inserted at the project start date. We changed that option much earlier on in the course. And if I open up that task and go to its Advanced tab, I'll see that the constraint on that task is that it should start as soon as possible. And when scheduling from a start date, and when you have the project start date as the default date for new tasks, that is the constraint that new tasks get. Generally speaking, they should start as soon as possible. There are a number of constraints that you can set on tasks. As late as possible, this is the default when you are scheduling to an end date. But you can also say that a task should finish no earlier than a specific date. Finish no later than a specific date. It must finish on a specific date. It must start on a specific date. It must start no earlier than or start no later than a certain date. Now it's quite often external factors that mean you need to put constraints other than straightforward ones such as soon as possible onto a task. In many cases, when you're scheduling from a start date, as we are here, as soon as possible is the best bet because you're basically trying to get all of the tasks done as soon as possible without restricting project to doing certain things on certain dates. But let's take an example of a possible constraint. Let's suppose that we already know that one of the bridesmaids, who is the bride's sister, is actually out of the country. She's working abroad at the moment, and she's not going to be available for the select and order bridesmaids dresses task until the beginning of March 2016. So whatever else happens, she won't be available until then. Now if I double click on that task and go to the Advanced tab, I can say constraint start no earlier than, and then I can choose a date of March the 1st, 2016. And when Project 2016 schedules the wedding, it will take into account that constraint that we can't start earlier than that. Now you may want at this point to put a note in here to remind yourself why you put that constraint in. But as you can see, Project 2016 has successfully rescheduled that task to make sure that it doesn't actually begin until the beginning of March. Now with the plan as it is at the moment, and considering that particular task, the constraint that we've just added really has had quite an impact on the duration of the whole plan. So you've seen there an example of a constraint. Let's look next at deadlines. Deadlines in many ways are quite similar to constraints, but there are two or three really important differences. One difference is that a deadline is very easily visible in the Gantt chart. It's actually a physical marker in the Gantt chart. And you get not only a marker in the Gantt chart, but you can get warning indicators in the indicator column to the left of the table. Another major difference is that although constraints are used in scheduling, as you saw just now with the limitation on the availability of one of the bridesmaids, deadlines are not actually used in scheduling. They are used in some calculations associated with scheduling, but they don't actually affect the schedule itself. So let's suppose that we decided, obviously we want the wedding to be a success, but if possible we'd like it to be before the beginning of September 2016, partly because of the weather. So what I'm going to do is to go down to the wedding date task itself, the wedding day 41, open that up, and I'm going to go to the Advanced tab, and I'm going to put a deadline on it, and the deadline I'm going to put on it is September the 1st, 2016. Click on OK. Now you can't actually see September at the moment in the Gantt chart on the right there, so let me just zoom out a little. And now you can see that deadline marker, the green arrow there. If I hover over it, deadline, task, wedding day, deadline Thursday, September 1st. Now that's a purely visual marker. It won't put a physical limitation, but clearly as we work further on the plan we need to try to make sure that the wedding day never moves to the right of that date. We've got quite a lot more to do on it yet, so we don't need to worry about it too much at the moment. And as I say, if we do start to get a problem, we will see an indicator in the I column to the left of the table. So I have two other things to do in this section, both fairly quick things to show you. First of all, I'm going to go into options, and you may recall on the schedule page one of the options, auto scheduled tasks scheduled on, and we changed it to project start date, which is the setting that I usually use. But let me just change that to current date. Click on OK and insert another new task. Now if I look at the constraints on that new task, it doesn't have an as soon as possible constraint. It has a start no earlier than constraint of today, which means, as the constraint implies, that that task cannot be scheduled by Project 2016 to start earlier than that date. So that's an important distinction. I'm now going to cancel that. I'm going to delete both of those new tasks. So right click, delete, right click, delete, and I'll just change that option back to the setting I prefer of project start date. The second thing that I want to do here is to make quite a big change. Right near the beginning of the plan, task ID 2, agree budget and approach. In terms of project management itself, quite often projects have phases, and probably the most likely phase with a wedding planning project would be that we'd start off by saying, well, how much money are we going to need to spend on this? What sort of level of spending are we looking at? And what will our approach be? So for example, are we talking about a relatively small family wedding with maybe just immediate family, dozen people, maybe 20 people, or are we talking about a much grander affair with 200 or 300 guests and maybe even more than that attending the reception and entertainment in the evening? Now really that particular task is a precursor to virtually everything else within the schedule. And sometimes when you've been looking at a plan for a while like this one, you may decide, actually I'm not 100% sure about that planning task at the beginning there, because setting the wedding date and agree budget and approach are really two completely separate tasks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to promote task 2, which I can do from the mini toolbar, and I'm also going to promote set wedding date, and I'm going to remove that planning task, which now no longer has, I feel like, a life of its own or any function of its own. And then I'm going to make task 1 a predecessor of each of the summary tasks. So 3 attire, its predecessor is 1. So what I've done is to go through and put task 1 as a predecessor on each of those other summary tasks, and this reflects the fact that as you get more and more detail and accuracy in a plan, you may well want to restructure it. You may want to take everything from attire onwards and put that inside a sort of super summary task, which would make it much easier to represent the fact that everything in that task follows after the task with ID 1. Something else you can do, which often makes it easier to read a plan, to understand the structure of it, if I select task 3, on the task tab in the insert group, on the task button, one of the options is blank row. And you can insert blank rows quite neatly into a project plan, and very often that emphasizes the structure of the plan. Note also, let's take this task here with ID 1. If I insert a blank row, watch what happens to all of the predecessors in the predecessor column. That task is now task 2, and of course other task IDs are updated accordingly, but Project 2016 takes care of all of that for you. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Welcome back to our course on Project 2016. In this section we're going to look at milestones. And milestones are used to denote significant points or events in a project. Usually milestone tasks have 0 duration, but Project 2016 does allow milestones with non-zero durations as well. Milestones are used for a number of different purposes, and amongst the most important ones are as a way of providing a management snapshot of progress on a project. So there is, for example, a particular report called a milestone report, where you can just view the key milestones in the project and get a summary of where you are in terms of those milestones, which in turn gives you a good idea of general progress on the project. They can also be used to show you what's coming up next, what's happening say over the next week or the next month or the next few days. And very often milestones are associated with a payment schedule of some sort. So for example, when a particular point is reached in a project, there may be a payment to make. Now what I'm going to do with the wedding project is to take some of the existing tasks and turn them into milestones, and I may well introduce 1 or 2 new milestones as I go through. Before I start, note what I've done with the project at this stage. This is version 3 of the project. I have collapsed all of the summary tasks. Note that when I do this, you can't see all of the dependencies. So for instance, there is a dependency between a task in wedding day and the setting of the wedding date. But because wedding day is collapsed, you can't see that link. If I expand wedding day, that link is now visible. Note the link from book wedding venue, task 40, up to set wedding date. But when wedding day as a summary task is collapsed, you can no longer see that link. So this just emphasizes the point that when you're looking at a project with some summary task collapse, you need to be careful at what you're interpreting, because some elements of the project may have become invisible, even though they're actually quite significant. Now, one very important aspect of milestones is that generally speaking, although I should say there are exceptions, but generally speaking, because a milestone is a task of 0 duration, it is assumed that there is little or no work associated with the milestone itself. If I take task 4 here, set wedding date, if that doesn't actually involve any significant amount of work, I could make it into a milestone. But what I'm actually going to do on this occasion is to insert specifically a milestone which indicates when that task has been completed. So I'm going to select the task below it, which is basically a blank row, and then on the task tab in the insert group I'm going to say insert task. Now that task I'm going to rename to wedding date set. So that's basically a statement that something has happened. It isn't something to do itself. And then in the duration for that task I'm going to change it to 0 days, which will make it into a milestone. And the default notation, the default symbol in a Gantt chart for a milestone is a diamond. So now I'm going to select set wedding date and select wedding date set and link them in the usual way. And I have my first milestone in my project. Now I'm also going to set milestones that indicate when the venues have been booked, the venue for the wedding and the venue for the reception. So let's start with the reception venue. So I want something to indicate that task 21 has been completed. I can do the same that I did just now, insert task, but there's also an option within the insert group on the task tab of insert milestone. So that automatically gives me a task of 0 duration. Let's change the name. Once again, put in the linkage. Do the same down here for the wedding venue. And then I've just got a very few other milestones to add. I'm going to add one to indicate that all of the attire has been ordered, one to indicate that the guest list has been finalized, and finally that the wedding is registered and licensed. And then I have just one more thing to do, and that is that I'm going to turn the wedding day itself into a milestone. But I don't want to reduce its duration to 0 days because there will be things to do on the wedding day itself. So what I'm going to do is to double click on the wedding day, and I'm going to use on the Advanced tab this little checkbox in the bottom left hand corner, mark task as milestone. Click on OK. The task is now marked as a milestone, but as you can see its duration is a day and there will be work for people to do on that day. Let's hope they don't think about it too much as work, but as far as Microsoft Project is concerned, it is work. So there we are, we have some milestones in our project. I'm going to take a look at those in just a moment. Before we do, I don't actually need the timeline at the moment, and the project is beginning to take up more and more space. So let's save a bit of space by hiding the timeline. Can you remember how to do that? You go to the View tab and you can just switch off the timeline. So uncheck that checkbox in Split View. And we now have a little bit more space to see the project. If you only wanted to see the milestones, you can use one of the features of the View tab, which is to use a filter. And in the Data group on the View tab, there is a filter control with a drop down there, and one of the options on the drop down is Milestones. And if I select that, I will only see the project milestones. And that gives you some idea of how useful milestones can be in terms of setting out the key points in the project over the course of its duration. Now, one other point that's clear here is that we still have a lot of work to do on this project because, for instance, we still haven't worked out when the wedding day is going to be. It's still right near the beginning of the project. Now, you might be a little bit frustrated by this and thinking, well, why don't we sort out the wedding date? Well, the reason that we don't is that we still have some very key factors to take into account before we can work out when the wedding date can be. And we're going to be moving on to those factors after we've done exercise 3. Once we've done those, we'll be in a better position to actually pin down a wedding day, and then we'll see again how useful these milestones can be in terms of giving us a realistic summary of the key points in the project. Now, if I've applied a filter, as I have here, I can unapply it by clicking on that drop down again and saying no filter. That's the end of this section. Exercise 3 is the next one, so please join me for that. Welcome back to our course on Project 2016. In this section I'm going to set you exercise 3, and as exercises go, this is actually quite a long exercise. It will take you a little while to work your way through this one, and it has a few constituent parts. What we're going to do is to take the bathroom refit project, and not only are we going to add the durations of the various component tasks, but we're going to put in dependencies, and we are going to change the overall structure of the project for reasons that I'm going to explain first. Now, sometimes when you go through a project and have your first try at listing all of the tasks, and as we've done here, grouping them together in some way, you may be quite successful and make a thorough list of what's required in the project, but you won't necessarily structure it in a way that lends itself either to easy scheduling and planning or to easy understanding. And you can finish up in a situation, and this is what was happening in the wedding project, that you finish up with many complicated dependencies. So for instance, I have a summary task here, preparation, task 16, and one of its subtasks is prepare for painting. Now we know that further down in the plan we have a paint task, and clearly one predecessor of the paint task is going to have to be prepare for painting. But there will also be various tasks following on from painting that depend on it, such as actually fitting the equipment. Now, whilst a number of dependencies are obviously going to be the cornerstone of scheduling the project, you can greatly simplify the structure of the project once you've got your basic list of tasks by dividing the project into phases and making each phase as self-contained as possible. Now what we're going to do with the bathroom refit project is to make 4 phases. We could do it in 3, but I'm going to make it into 4 phases. And from the point of view of dependencies, each of the 4 phases is going to be self-dependent. It's going to be independent of the others. Now looking at what's involved in this bathroom refit, the 4 phases that I think we should divide the project into are basically a planning, a phase of activities that happen before we start doing the work, so the planning certainly, but also arranging the finance and appointing the contractors. All of that's going to happen. Those first 3 summary tasks are going to form one phase. The second phase is going to be a purchasing phase. There's quite a lot of selecting to do. I need to select paint, equipment, tiles and so on, and I need to order it and get it delivered. And I'm going to get all of that done before the work actually starts. Now of course you could have some of the materials arriving once work has started, but for the purposes of simplicity in planning this project, I'm going to get all of the purchasing done and all of the deliveries arranged before I actually start doing any work. The third phase will be the work itself, the implementation itself. We'll call that the implementation phase. And then the final phase will be one where any snags are dealt with and there's a sort of cleaning up phase, making sure that everything is ready to be used. Now in order to give you the information you need to do this division into 4 phases, let's take a look at my answer to exercise 3. So there you see the 4 phases as collapsed summary tasks. Task 2 is the planning phase summary task. Its total duration is 12 days, and you see the columns of information. Clearly the values in the duration columns for the summary task will be derived from the durations of its subtasks, but the predecessors column shows you the predecessors of the summary task, and the successors column shows you the successors of the summary task. So if you take, for example, task ID 21, purchasing phase, its predecessor, the one it depends on, is task 2, which is the planning phase, and its successor, the one that comes after it, is task 40, which is the implementation phase. So you can see there the very simple structure of the overall project in those 4 phases. Now, if I open up one of the phases, I'll give you an overview now of the dependencies and how they work within the phase. Within the planning phase, there are 3 summary tasks, as before, although I have moved finance after contractors. And basically, with these 3 summary tasks, the individual durations are there, and lots of individual dependencies within the planning phase are there. So for instance, scoping, task 4, has 5 successors, 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9. And these include selecting the style, deciding whether we're going to have a project manager or not, checking what permissions are required, if any, to do the work, fixing the dates for the work, and arranging temporary accommodation to use while the bathroom is out of action. And then we have the summary task contractors, where we get some contractor recommendations, make a short list, get some quotations, appoint the contractors. Note that the get contractor recommendations task runs in parallel with some early phases of planning. But we won't be getting contractor quotations until the planning summary task 3 is complete, because we want to be clear about exactly what we're expecting the contractor to do. Implicit in this arrangement is the fact that we don't believe that any choices we make about tiles and so on will significantly affect the contractor quotation. But that's another point to bear in mind. If the contractor says, well, depending on the type of floor you get or the type of tiles you get, you may increase or decrease the cost of the quotation, one would normally have to bear that in mind. So that's the contractor's summary task. Then we have the finance summary task. Once we've got our contractor quotations, we can set about arranging the finance. Now, in order to help you to get all of these numbers right, to get the durations in, get the dependencies right and so on, I've prepared a text file for each of the 4 phases, which is in the exercise folder, and it lists the durations and the dependencies, the predecessors and successors, in terms of the task IDs in my answer to exercise 3. If for some reason your IDs are differently numbered to mine, then clearly that will affect all of these predecessors and successor values. But hopefully your ID numbers are the same as mine, so you should be able to use this to help you not only to enter the appropriate durations, but also to set up all of the correct dependencies. So you're looking now at the text file for the planning phase. There is a text file for each phase in the exercise folder. So here's the purchasing phase. You may be wondering throughout why you can't see start and finish dates here in my answer to exercise 3. Well, whenever you're working your way through exercise 3, it won't be on the same dates that I'm recording this. So to a large extent, the dates, if I gave you my dates, wouldn't really help you. The durations are important, the dependencies are important, but I'm assuming throughout that your dates will be different from mine. But I've got a little twist in the tail of that towards the end of this section on exercise 3. Okay, so that's the purchasing phase, pretty straightforward. It includes the delivery of each of the materials, tiles and so on. So at the end of this, I've introduced a milestone there, task 38, all materials on site, as a significant milestone in the project. Next we have the implementation phase. Let me explain the main points here. We set up a skip, a receptacle for the waste products which arise from gutting the existing bathroom and from the building work that we're going to do in fitting the new bathroom. Then we have a lot of preparation to do, prepare for tiling, prepare for flooring, so there may be joist work to do, there may be plastering to do, etc. And we do the first fix electrics and the first fix plumbing. These are the electrics that go over the ceiling, behind the walls, under the floor. Similarly, the plumbing that you can't see, the waste pipes and so on. Then we do the painting, the flooring, the tiling, any other wall work that's needed, general building work there, such as 55, 57, 59. Then we start the second fix electrics. This is things like putting the sockets on the walls, and the second fix plumbing, which will be things like the pipes from the pipework behind the walls, but this is the visible pipework that connects up to the taps, the faucets. It's often the case nowadays that there is some kind of electrical certification needed once the electrical work is finished, so that's task 50 here. And then once the second fix is underway, fitting the equipment begins, task 61, and when the fitting of the equipment is finished, we have a milestone, task 62. The final phase, the completion phase, is simplicity itself. We have a task to resolve any outstanding snags. We clean up and we declare the refit complete. There is one last part to exercise 3, and the last part is to move the start date of the project to the first working day of the month following your current month. Clearly your dates will be different to my dates. I'm doing this in late December 2015, so I'm going to move the start of this project to January the 4th, 2016, which is the first working day for me in that year. When we looked at the project information dialog earlier on in the course, you saw a way of changing a project start date. But once you've got a project set up and you have constraints and deadlines set up, the way that you would change the start date of a project so that the constraints and deadlines are moved in line with any change you're making is to use the Move Project option, which is in the Schedule group on the Project tab. You choose your new start date. In this case, I'm going to choose January 4th, 2016. Make sure that Move Deadlines is checked. That will move the deadlines and constraint dates. Click on OK, and my project is now moved to start on January 4th, 2016. So that's the last part of the exercise for you. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To get the Project 2016 course exercise and instructor demo file, click over here. And click over there to watch the complete 7-hour beginner course for Microsoft Project 2016.